On October 28, 1944, at 6:14 in the morning, Keiji Nakamura landed on an island so small it did not appear on civilian maps, climbed out of his aircraft, and was handed a clipboard with a fuel inventory that told him, in plain numbers, that he had enough resources to conduct approximately 40 more flight hours before his detachment became permanently grounded. He looked at the number. He looked at Sato, his ground crew chief, who had compiled the inventory and was watching him with the expression of a man who already knew what the number meant. Keiji signed the clipboard, handed it back, and said they would begin rationing immediately. Then he walked to the edge of the coral airstrip and looked at the ocean and thought about the 43 pilots he had watched die in the past 2 years, and understood, in a way he could not yet fully articulate, that this island was where his war was going to end. He just did not know yet that the ending would take 7 more years. Keiji was 22 years old. He had been flying since 19, fighting since 20, and by the standards of 1944 Japanese naval aviation, this made him ancient. The Imperial Navy that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor had been built on pilots with 3,000 hours of flight experience, men who had been flying since before the war began, who had refined their skills over China and Southeast Asia until they were operating at a level that American pilots in the early months of the conflict simply could not match. By 1944, almost all of those men were dead. What replaced them were teenagers with 40 hours of training, orders to be brave, and a life expectancy over the Pacific that could be measured in weeks. Keiji had spent 3 months on Formosa watching those teenagers die in training before they ever reached combat. Boys who pulled back on the stick when they should have pushed. Boys who forgot to check fuel at altitude. Boys who froze during their first simulated engagement and never unfroze in time. He taught them everything he knew with the focus of a man trying to empty a reservoir with a teacup, knowing the reservoir was draining faster than he could empty it. One student, a boy named Taro, 18 years old, from a village in Nagano, that he described in such specific detail that Keiji could picture every street, asked him one evening what it actually felt like to kill another pilot in the air. Keiji thought about it seriously, because Taro deserved a serious answer, and said it felt like solving a problem that was trying to solve you at the same time. Taro nodded as though this made sense. 8 weeks later, northeast of Leyte, Taro became a footnote in a battle summary report. 2 lines. His name spelled slightly wrong. Keiji kept flying. This is the thing that people who have not been in sustained combat do not understand about men like Keiji Nakamura. It was not courage that kept him in the air. It was not ideology, though he had been raised inside an ideology as completely as a fish is raised inside water. It was something more mechanical and more human than either of those things. He was a pilot. Flying was the only language in which he was fully fluent. When he was in the cockpit, surrounded by the smell of fuel and oil and the particular vibration of the engine through the frame, the world reduced to a set of problems that had solutions, and he was very good at finding solutions. On the ground, in the larger war, there were no solutions. There was only the shrinking. By the time he reached the island in October, the shrinking had become impossible to ignore. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had just ended in a Japanese defeat so catastrophic that even the censored official reports could not fully conceal its dimensions. 4 carriers lost, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 500 aircraft. The numbers were so large they stopped feeling like numbers. And yet the orders that arrived with Keiji's detachment were written in the language of a force that still believed it was fighting a war. It could win. Conduct, reconnaissance. Report ship movements. Provide air cover as needed. Await further orders. He had 4 pilots, including himself. 4 aircraft. One with a hydraulic problem that grounded it for the first week. Fuel enough for 40 hours of flight time. A communication station with a transmitter that worked inconsistently, and as the weeks passed, less and less. The first month was almost routine. Keiji flew his patrols. His pilots flew theirs. Sato rationed the fuel with the precision of a jeweler weighing diamonds. Reports went out. Acknowledgments came back, then came back less often, then stopped coming back at all. Keiji filed this under technical malfunction and kept working. In November, the American aircraft started appearing without caution. This was the detail that told him more than any intelligence report could have. In contested airspace, enemy aircraft move with specific behaviors. They vary altitude. They fly in protective formations. They scan constantly. What Keiji began seeing over and around the island in November were American aircraft moving with the relaxed confidence of men flying over territory they considered completely safe. They did not vary their altitude. They did not scan the way you scan when you expect someone to be watching. They moved like a person walks through their own house in the dark, certain of the furniture. He filed a report about this. The transmitter sent it into silence. Then December came, and everything that had been abstract became specific. His pilot Hiroshi was 20 years old. He had been flying for 11 months. He was conducting a standard reconnaissance patrol, low altitude, northern shore. Nothing tactical about it. Just observation. The kind of flight they had done 100 times. 2 American Hellcats found him at 600 feet over the water. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. Keiji knew this because one of the shore garrison soldiers watched it from the beach with field binoculars and reported it afterwards with the careful thoroughness of a man who understood he was describing something that could not be undone. The soldier said Hiroshi never had a chance to maneuver. He was low and slow, and they came out of the sun from above and behind, which is the oldest approach in aerial combat, used for exactly one reason, which is that it works. The first burst hit the engine. The second hit the cockpit. The aircraft went into the water at a shallow angle and did not come back up. Hiroshi had a younger sister in Osaka. He kept her photograph folded inside his flight jacket, against his chest. Keiji had seen it once, when Hiroshi showed it to him during a conversation about home that pilots have when they are trying to remind themselves that home still exists. The sister was maybe 15 in the photograph, standing in front of a garden, squinting slightly into the sun, the way people squint when someone tells them to smile, and they are not entirely sure how. Keiji walked to the end of the airstrip that evening and stood there until it was completely dark. He did not know what he was waiting for. He was not waiting for anything. He was just standing in a place that felt appropriate for what he was feeling, which was something that had no clean name in any language, but which every person who has ever lost someone in a pointless way has felt at least once. Not grief, exactly. More like anger at the geometry of the thing. The randomness of which body happened to be in which piece of sky at which moment. He went back and updated the patrol log. He wrote a report. He handed it to the communications operator, who sent it into the same silence that had been swallowing everything for weeks. By January 1945, Keiji had 2 operational aircraft, 3 pilots, and a fuel supply that Sato had rationed down to a number that required them to choose, for every patrol, whether it was worth flying at all. The garrison soldiers had received no resupply since November. Their commander, Captain Watanabe, had the demeanor of a man who had done the mathematics of his situation and arrived at an answer he had decided not to share with anyone. He and Keiji shared meals sometimes. They talked about small things: food, weather, aircraft mechanics. They did not talk about the fact that they had not received orders in 2 months, or what that meant, or what they were supposed to do when the fuel ran out. In February, headquarters made contact for the first time since December. The message said to hold. It said the situation was developing. It said further orders would follow. No further orders followed. What Keiji did not know, and had no way of knowing, was that the officer who had signed his original deployment orders had been killed in December, that his detachment had been listed in a logistics document under the category of units with which contact had been lost, that the headquarters which sent the February message was itself preparing to relocate, and that in the chaos of relocation, a detachment on a small, unmapped island with an unreliable transmitter and dwindling fuel was not anyone's priority. In the bureaucracy of a collapsing military operation, things fall through gaps. Keiji's detachment fell through a gap. He did not know any of this. He knew what his orders said. Hold. He was very good at following orders. This had always been one of his strengths. He could hold an aircraft in formation through turbulence that sent other pilots drifting. He could hold altitude in crosswind conditions that made instruments unreliable. He had learned, over 4 years of military service, that the ability to hold position when everything around you was shifting was the difference between pilots who survived and pilots who did not. He held. By August 1945, his communications equipment had failed completely. The transmitter had burned out in a tropical storm in June, and the parts required to fix it were not on the island, and there was no way to request them. Keiji was flying his remaining patrols on fuel Sato now measured in individual liters. He was observing American ship traffic that moved through the surrounding waters with complete impunity. He was filing reports in a logbook that no one would read, in a war that had already ended without him. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke on the radio and told the Japanese people that Japan had surrendered. He spoke for 4.5 minutes. The language he used was formal to the point of being nearly incomprehensible to ordinary listeners, but the meaning was clear enough. It was over. Keiji did not hear this broadcast. His radio could no longer transmit. Its receiving function had also degraded to the point of unreliability. He was on patrol when the broadcast aired, 200 meters above an ocean that did not look any different than it had the day before, watching a horizon that offered no information about the fact that the entire context of his existence had just changed. He landed. He logged the patrol. He ate dinner with his 2 remaining pilots, and Sato and 6 of the ground crew. Someone had found a small amount of rice wine, and they passed it around without any particular ceremony, the way men share things when they are together in a difficult place, and small gestures are the only warmth available. Keiji looked at the sky after dinner. Clear. Stars beginning to show. The sound of the ocean exactly as it always was. He thought, tomorrow. Patrol at first light. He did not know that there would be no reason to fly tomorrow. He did not know that there would be no reason to fly for another 7 years. He did not know that the war he was holding his position for had ended hours ago, that boys his age in Tokyo were sitting in the rubble of their city, trying to understand what peace meant, that Hiroshi's sister in Osaka was alive, and the garden in the photograph still existed. He knew one thing. His orders said to hold. And Keiji Nakamura had never in his life failed to hold. Here is the thing about a war ending. It does not end everywhere at the same time. It ends in conference rooms and on the decks of battleships, and in the offices of generals who sign documents while photographers take pictures. It ends in capital cities, where people pour into the streets and cry and embrace strangers. It ends on radio frequencies and in newspaper headlines and in the telegrams that arrive at family homes with the word survived instead of the word killed. It ends eventually in the minds of the soldiers who were fighting it, when something reaches them, a broadcast, an order, a white flag, the face of an enemy who has stopped trying to kill them, and their mind accepts that the context has changed. For Keiji Nakamura, nothing reached him. And so, for Keiji Nakamura, the war did not end. On September 3rd, 1945, 19 days after Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, a United States Navy patrol boat operating near a small island group in the southern Philippines was attacked by a single-engine Japanese fighter. The pilot came out of the sun from the southeast, low and fast, exactly as he had been trained. He misjudged his range by approximately 40 meters. His rounds hit the water short of the hull. The patrol boat crew returned fire. The aircraft broke off, climbed hard into cloud cover, and vanished. The crew filed a report. The officer who received it wrote, "Isolated holdout" in the margin, and placed it in a folder with 11 similar reports from the previous 3 weeks. The folder sat on a desk in Manila for 6 weeks before a man named David Pierce picked it up. Pierce was 31 years old, a lieutenant commander from Portland, Oregon, assigned to a post-war intelligence unit whose job was to locate and recover remaining Japanese military personnel throughout the Philippine theater. He was methodical, patient, and possessed of a quality that was rarer than it sounds, the ability to read a document and ask not just what it said, but what it meant. He had been doing this work for 4 months. He had seen enough holdout cases to know the difference between a desperate man doing something irrational and a trained soldier doing something that made complete sense within a specific framework. The patrol boat attack was the second kind. He read the crew's description 3 times. Attack from the direction of the sun. Low-altitude approach to minimize radar profile. Clean break into cloud cover after the pass. These were not the actions of a man in psychological collapse. These were textbook maneuvers, executed deliberately by someone who had thought about the approach before making it. Whoever flew that aircraft was not confused. He was not panicking. He was conducting an attack the way he had been taught to conduct attacks, against an enemy he had decided was still a legitimate target. Pierce pulled the report out of the folder, put it on his desk, and started looking for everything else connected to it. What he found over the next 2 weeks should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. But no one had been paying attention, because no one had been looking at these islands as a connected picture. 3 fishing vessels attacked or buzzed by a single unidentified aircraft between August and October. a coast watcher on a neighboring island who had logged 2 reconnaissance sightings. A Filipino scout unit that had briefly surveyed one of the islands in late September and found something that had been noted in their report and then apparently ignored by everyone who read it afterward. A logbook. The scouts had found it in a storage shelter near a coral airstrip. Standard Japanese military flight log. Entries running from late October 1944 through early August 1945. Pierce requested the original through 3 separate channels before it finally arrived on his desk in a manila envelope with a routing slip that had been signed by 4 different people, none of whom had apparently read what was inside it. He opened it and started from the beginning. The handwriting was compact and precise. The entries were professional. Patrol times, headings, fuel states, weather, ship sightings. The writing of a man who had been trained to observe accurately and record what he observed without editorializing. Pierce read for 2 hours without stopping. Then he reached the entry from March 14, 1945, and he stopped. The entry described an American transport aircraft sighted at medium altitude, heading northeast, clearly non-combatant configuration. And then, in the same careful handwriting as every other entry, 4 words that Pierce read and reread until they had fully registered. Engagement not initiated, non-combatant. He sat back in his chair. This pilot, alone on an island with no communication and no resupply, conducting patrols in a war he had no way of knowing, had already effectively been decided, had seen an unarmed transport aircraft and chosen not to shoot it down. He had made a judgment. He had assessed a target, applied the rules of engagement as he understood them, and exercised restraint. Not because anyone was watching, not because anyone would ever know, because it was the correct thing to do according to the code he operated by. Pierce thought about this for a long time. Then he kept reading. The last entry in the logbook was dated August 7th, 1945. 8 days before the surrender broadcast. It read, "Patrol completed. No significant contacts. Fuel state critical. Transmitter remains inoperative. Awaiting orders. Awaiting orders." Pierce closed the logbook carefully and set it on his desk next to the patrol boat report and the fishing vessel accounts and the coast watcher sightings and everything else he had assembled, and looked at the picture they made together. A Japanese naval pilot, almost certainly alone or nearly alone at this point, still flying patrols on a remote island, still logging his observations in a book that no one was reading, still waiting for orders from a command structure that had ceased to exist in any meaningful form months ago. He wrote a contact recommendation the same afternoon. Detailed, specific, with a clear operational plan. He recommended approaching the island with documentation, a Japanese-speaking officer, and a letter from a senior Japanese naval officer who could speak to the authenticity of the surrender in terms a military man would accept. He recommended patience and multiple attempts. He recommended treating the situation as what it was, not a security problem, but a human one. His recommendation came back approved 6 weeks later with resources allocated for 1 attempt. 1. They approached the island on a clear morning in February 1946. Pierce, a translator named Yamamoto, who had grown up in California and spoke Japanese with a formality that Pierce hoped would register as respectful rather than foreign, and 2 enlisted men. White flag mounted at the bow, visible from 2 kilometers. They anchored offshore, and Yamamoto called out through a megaphone. The war had ended. They carried documents. They were asking for a meeting. The island gave them nothing back. Just the sound of water and birds and the particular silence of a place where someone is listening without responding. They waited 90 minutes. Then they went ashore. The airstrip had been recently used. Pierce knew this the moment they stepped onto the coral. The surface showed fresh compression marks from aircraft tires. There were oil stains that had not fully dried. The smell of aviation fuel was faint but present. The specific chemical smell that does not last more than a few days in tropical heat. Someone had been here within the last 72 hours. They found the storage shelter. Pierce placed the folder of documents inside, the surrender copies, the photographs from the signing ceremony, the letter from the Japanese naval officer. He weighted it with a stone. Then he took out the letter he had written himself the night before, in English, knowing it could not be read, and placed it on top. He had spent 2 hours writing that letter. He was not entirely sure why. The pilot could not read English. The letter served no operational purpose. But there was something Pierce needed to say to this man that the official documents did not say. Something about the fact that what he had done out here, alone, without support or recognition or any reasonable expectation of survival, was not nothing. That it had been seen. That someone had read the logbook and understood what it represented. He wrote that the war was over and that the pilot had more than fulfilled any obligation he had ever owed to anyone. He wrote that there was a world outside this island that was continuing, imperfectly, and with great difficulty, but continuing, and that the pilot had a place in it, if he wanted one. He signed it with his name and the date, and left it there. They walked back to the boat in silence. Pierce was pulling the anchor when his translator grabbed his arm. The aircraft was at approximately 4,000 feet, directly above the island, making a slow left-hand circle. Japanese Navy fighter, single engine, the silhouette unmistakable even at altitude. It circled once, then again. Then a third time, slower than the first two, as though the pilot was looking at something on the ground below and trying to decide what it meant. Then it turned north, climbed into a bank of cloud, and was gone. None of the 4 men on the boat said anything for almost a minute. Pierce watched the sky where the aircraft had been. He thought about the logbook entry from March. Engagement not initiated. He thought about the fisherman on the neighboring island who had told an interviewer that the Japanese pilot had looked directly down at him from the cockpit and not fired. He thought about a 22-year-old who had landed on this island in October 1944 with 4 aircraft and 40 hours of fuel and orders that said hold, and who had held, with a consistency and a discipline and a loneliness that most people could not sustain for a week, let alone for years. He thought about the letter sitting in the shelter, in a language the pilot could not read. Yamamoto said quietly, almost to himself, that he was still up there. Pierce said yes. Yamamoto asked what they were going to do. Pierce looked at the island one more time. The airstrip was not visible from the water, but he knew exactly where it was now. The pale coral scar through the green, the oil stains, the compression marks from tires that had landed and launched and landed again hundreds of times over the past year and a half, in a war that existed now only in one man's cockpit. He said they were going to come back, with better documents, a different approach, someone the pilot might actually recognize as legitimate, something that could penetrate the framework instead of bouncing off it. Because the problem, Pierce had understood by now with complete clarity, was not that Keiji Nakamura was irrational. The problem was the opposite. He was entirely rational. He was applying a coherent logic to the information available to him. And the information available to him supported the conclusion he had reached. To change the conclusion, you had to change the information. And to change the information, you had to reach him. And reaching him, it turned out, was going to be the hardest thing David Pierce had ever tried to do. Above the clouds, somewhere to the north, an engine turned and a pilot flew his heading and logged his observations in a book that was almost full, and waited for orders that he was absolutely certain were coming. He had been waiting for 553 days. He would wait for 2,912 more. In the 8 years that followed the first contact attempt, David Pierce tried 7 times to reach Keiji Nakamura. He tried a Japanese naval officer broadcasting over a radio transmitter aimed at the island. Keiji did not respond. He tried dropping leaflets from a low-flying aircraft, thousands of them, printed with the text of the surrender document, and photographs of the formal signing ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. The leaflets drifted across the island like paper snow. 2 days later, Pierce's contact in the area reported that the Japanese aircraft had resumed its patrol pattern, unchanged. He tried a former Japanese general, a man who had personally known officers in Keiji's original command chain, recording a message that was broadcast repeatedly on a frequency Pierce's analysts believed the island's receiving equipment might still pick up. Nothing. He tried sending a Filipino intermediary, a local fisherman, who had seen the aircraft dozens of times and was willing to approach the island by boat with documents and a white flag and a specific verbal message in Japanese that Yamamoto had written and the fisherman had memorized phonetically. The fisherman returned, shaken. He said he had landed on the beach and placed the documents on the sand and begun reciting the message and heard, from somewhere in the tree line, the unmistakable sound of a bolt being worked on a rifle. He had left the documents and walked back to his boat without turning around. Keiji was not alone. He still had at least one other person with him. This changed Pierce's understanding of the situation significantly. A single man in isolation was one psychological problem. A small group that had developed its own internal consensus about reality was a different and harder problem. They were reinforcing each other. Every day they did not receive orders was another day their shared framework absorbed the absence and produced an explanation. The transmitter was broken. Headquarters was occupied with the larger situation. The war in certain theaters was still active. Each man looked at the others and saw confirmation that what they believed was correct. Because why would everyone believe something that was not true? It was, Pierce wrote in a report, that his superiors found overly philosophical, the architecture of a shared delusion built entirely from reasonable materials. In 1951, Pierce was reassigned. His unit was dissolved as the military reorganized for the Korean War, and resources shifted accordingly. He handed his files to a junior officer who had no particular interest in them, shook hands with Yamamoto, and flew back to the United States. He carried the logbook with him. Technically, it was evidence in an ongoing recovery case and should have stayed in the files. He told himself he would return it. He never did. For 2 years, the case went essentially dormant. Occasional sightings were logged by fishermen and coast watchers. Occasional reports of an unidentified aircraft appeared in regional military communications. Nobody connected them with enough energy or authority to generate action. Then, in the spring of 1953, a young woman in Osaka received a letter. Her name was Fumiko Nakamura. She was 26 years old. She was Keiji's younger sister. The letter came from a Japanese government office responsible for tracking missing military personnel, and it informed her that new evidence had emerged suggesting her brother might still be alive on an island in the southern Philippines, and that a contact operation was being planned, and would she be willing to participate. She wrote back the same day. She said yes. What happened next was the most carefully planned of all the contact attempts, and the one that came closest to working, and the one that failed in the way that only things built from genuine love can fail, which is completely and without any possibility of dismissal. Fumiko recorded a message. She sat in a small room in a government building in Tokyo with a microphone in front of her, and a photograph of Keiji on the table beside it. A photograph from 1942, before the war had fully become what it became, when he was still 20 years old and standing in front of his first aircraft, with the expression of someone who has just been given something he cannot believe is actually his. She talked to the photograph while she recorded, because the technician told her it would help. And he was right, it did help. It made her voice do the thing that no amount of training or instruction can manufacture, which is the sound of someone telling the absolute truth to someone they love. She told him she was alive. She told him their mother had died in 1948, peacefully, in her sleep, which was the kindest thing the end of a difficult life had offered. She told him the house in Nagano still existed, and that she went back there sometimes in the summer, and that the garden was still there, overgrown now, but the bones of it still recognizable, the stone path, the old plum tree. She told him the war had ended, and that she was not saying this to deceive him, that there was no version of this situation in which deceiving him served any purpose anyone could imagine. She told him she wanted him to come home. She told him she was not angry. She told him she did not think less of him. She told him she had thought about him every single day for 9 years, and that whatever he had done out there, whatever he had believed was necessary, she did not need him to justify it or explain it. She just needed him to land the aircraft and come home. The broadcast was transmitted on 3 frequencies simultaneously for 6 consecutive days. On the 4th day, the patrol pattern changed. Pierce, who had been brought back specifically for this operation and was monitoring reports from his desk in Manila, with the focused attention of a man who has spent 9 years waiting for a specific thing to happen, received a field report from a coast watcher that said the Japanese aircraft had deviated from its established route and made 3 slow passes over the area of ocean from which the transmission signal was strongest. 3 passes. Low altitude. As though the pilot was trying to locate the source. He had heard it. Pierce authorized an immediate follow-up broadcast. Fumiko recorded a second message. This one was shorter. She said his name. She said she knew he had heard her. She said she was going to keep talking until he answered. She said she was not going anywhere. For 3 days after that, Nothing happened. Then, on the morning of the fourth day, a Filipino coast watcher on the neighboring island reported something he had never seen before in 9 years of watching that stretch of ocean. The Japanese aircraft had landed on a small beach on the eastern shore. Not the airstrip, the beach. A landing so technically demanding that the coast watcher, who had no aviation background, described it in his report simply as impossible. The aircraft sat on the beach for 40 minutes. The coast watcher could see through his binoculars that the canopy was open. He could see the pilot sitting in the cockpit, not moving, just sitting. Then, the engine started again. The aircraft took off from the beach, barely clearing the tree line at the end of the sand, climbed to altitude, and resumed the patrol pattern. Pierce read this report 4 times. He understood exactly what had happened. Keiji had heard his sister's voice. He had landed somewhere private, away from whoever else was with him, to sit with what he had heard, without an audience. And then he had taken off again. He had not come in. This was the moment that Pierce later described, in the only interview he ever gave about the case, as the one that broke something in him that had not been broken before. Not discouragement. Something more specific. The recognition that the truth, even delivered in the most unimpeachable form imaginable, by the voice of someone who loved you, in your own language, with nothing to gain from lying, was not automatically enough. That a man could hear the truth and feel it land and still climb back into the cockpit and resume the patrol. Because the alternative was not just accepting new information. The alternative was dismantling the entire structure of meaning he had built his survival around for 9 years. Accepting the truth meant accepting that Hiroshi had died for nothing, that Taro had died for nothing, that the 43 pilots Keiji had watched burn and fall over the Pacific had given their lives to a cause that had already been lost before most of them had even finished dying for it. It meant accepting that every patrol he had flown since August 1945, every hour of rationed fuel, every logbook entry, every decision to hold position and wait for orders, had been an act performed in a theater, with no audience, for a purpose that had evaporated while he was still in the middle of serving it. The truth was not the problem. The truth was a door. And opening a door is easy when there is somewhere comfortable to go through it. When what is on the other side is cold and dark and requires you to look back at everything you have done and ask whether any of it was real, a man can hear the knock and understand who is knocking and still choose, in that moment, to stay where he is. Keiji had heard his sister's voice. He had landed on the beach and sat with it for 40 minutes. And then he had taken off, because he was still a pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy, because his orders had not changed, because somewhere, in the part of him that flying had built and sustained and made the only reliable thing in a world that had taken everything else, he was not yet ready to stop being the man who held. Fumiko was told what had happened. She sat with the information quietly for a long time. Then she asked one question. She asked if they were going to try again. Pierce said yes. She said good. She said she would wait. On March 9th, 1952, a man named Keiji Nakamura landed his aircraft for the last time. Not because he was forced to, not because his engine finally quit, or his fuel ran out, or an American fighter caught him at low altitude with nowhere to go. He landed because a 63-year-old Japanese general named Yoshimi Tanaka stood on the coral airstrip of a small island in the southern Philippines in the morning heat and waited. And when the aircraft appeared over the tree line and made its first cautious pass, the general stood completely still with his hands visible at his sides and looked up. And something in that image, an old man standing alone in the open with no weapon and no fear, communicated something that 8 years of leaflets and broadcasts and official documents had failed to communicate: that this was real. The aircraft made 3 passes, each one lower than the last. On the third pass, it was low enough that the general could see the pilot's face through the canopy, and the pilot could see his. Then the aircraft climbed away, made a long, slow circuit of the island, and came back on a landing approach. It touched down hard. The left main gear took the weight unevenly. The aircraft rolled to a stop at the far end of the strip, and the engine went quiet. And for a moment, nothing moved at all. Then the canopy opened. Keiji Nakamura had been on that island for 2,912 days. He climbed out of the cockpit the same way he had climbed out of it 2,911 times before, left hand on the rail, right foot finding the wing root, the motion so deeply encoded in his body that it required no thought. He dropped to the ground. He was 30 years old. He had been 22 when he arrived. He stood next to the aircraft and looked at the general, and the general looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then the general said, in the formal language of the military, that the war had ended on August 15th, 1945, by order of His Majesty the Emperor, and that Lieutenant Nakamura had fulfilled his duty completely and was hereby relieved of his post. Keiji said nothing. He looked at the aircraft. He looked at the airstrip. He looked at the jungle edge where Sato was standing, the only other man left, 61 years old now, thin in a way that spoke of years of careful rationing, watching with an expression that contained everything and showed nothing. Then Keiji looked back at the general and asked one question. He asked how long. The general told him, 7 years, 6 months, 22 days. Keiji nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he receives information that his mind can process, but his body cannot yet absorb. He reached back into the cockpit and retrieved his logbook. He had filled 4 of them over the years. The others were in the shelter. But this one, the current one, he kept with him. He held it against his chest, the way you hold something you are not ready to put down yet. Because putting it down means accepting that you will not be picking it up again. He walked with the general to the far end of the strip and sat down in the shade. And Sato came and sat beside him, and for the next 2 hours he answered questions from a junior officer who had been assigned to take his debriefing. He answered everything accurately and completely. Patrol routes, fuel management, the decision in March 1945 not to engage a non-combatant aircraft, the night the transmitter burned out in the June storm. The morning he heard a woman's voice on the radio and landed on the beach and sat in the open cockpit for 40 minutes and then took off again. The debriefing officer asked him why he had taken off again that morning. Why, after hearing his sister's voice telling him the war was over, he had gone back to the patrol. Keiji thought about this question for a long time before answering. He said that he had believed her. He said he had known in that moment on the beach that she was not lying, that the war was over, that everything she said was true. He said the problem was not the truth. The problem was that accepting the truth required him to become a different person than the person who had landed on the beach, and he did not yet know who that person was, and he was not sure there was enough left of him outside the cockpit to find out. He said that the cockpit was the only place left where he knew exactly who he was. The debriefing officer wrote this down without comment. He was 24 years old and had never been in combat and did not fully understand what he had just been told. But David Pierce, who was sitting at the back of the shelter and was not officially part of the debriefing, understood it completely. He had spent 8 years trying to reach this man, and he had finally, with the help of an old general willing to stand in the open with his hands visible, succeeded. And now he was sitting 10 feet away, while the man explained, in simple and precise language, exactly what those 8 years had been about. They flew Keiji to Manila that afternoon, then to Tokyo the following morning. Fumiko was waiting at the airport. Pierce was not there for this. He had stayed in Manila. He told himself it was because he had work to finish. The truth was that he had spent 8 years constructing a version of this reunion in his mind, and he was not sure the real version could survive comparison with it. Some things are better completed in the imagination than witnessed. He heard about it afterward from Yamamoto, who had been there. Yamamoto said Fumiko had been standing at the gate for 3 hours before the aircraft landed. He said when Keiji came through the door, she did not run to him, which was what everyone expected, which was what happens in the stories people tell about reunions. She stopped. She looked at him, and then she said his name once quietly, the same way she had said it into the microphone in the Tokyo recording room 2 years earlier, with the same quality of absolute truth in it, and Keiji stopped walking and looked at her. And something in his face changed in a way that Yamamoto said he could not describe and did not try to. They stood about 3 feet apart for almost a minute. Then he closed the distance, and she put her arms around him, and they stayed like that for a long time, while the other passengers moved around them like water around 2 stones. Yamamoto said it was the quietest reunion he had ever seen. No crying, no dramatic words, just 2 people standing still in an airport while the world moved past them, making up in proximity what 8 years had taken in distance. Keiji spent 3 months in a military hospital outside Tokyo. The doctors found that he was in surprisingly good physical condition, given everything. Malnourished in ways that careful rationing had partially concealed. Hearing loss in his left ear from years of unprotected exposure to engine noise at close range. His hands had the specific calluses of a man who had spent years doing manual maintenance work, which he had, keeping the aircraft operational with diminishing tools and supplies. His eyes were exceptional. Whatever else the years on the island had taken, they had not taken his ability to see. The psychological evaluations were more complicated and took longer. The doctors used words like dissociation and sustained stress response and adaptive framework maintenance. What they meant, translated out of clinical language, was that Keiji had built a version of reality that kept him functional, and then lived inside it, with total commitment for 8 years, and that unwinding it was not a matter of accepting new information, but of reconstructing an entire relationship with the world. He was patient with the process. He answered the doctor's questions the same way he had answered the debriefing officer's questions, accurately and completely, without defensiveness or self-pity. He did not argue with the doctor's assessments. He did not insist that what he had done was rational. He did not insist that it was irrational either. He simply described what had happened, and what he had thought and why, and left the interpretation to people who had tools for it that he did not have. He asked once whether the men he had attacked after the surrender, the patrol boat crew in September 1945, had been hurt. The doctor told him no. The rounds had missed. Keiji nodded. He did not say anything else about it. But the doctor noted in his file that this was the only question Keiji had asked about consequences rather than facts. That it mattered to him. That beneath the 8 years of framework and orders and disciplined waiting, there was a man who had always known the difference between a problem and a person. He was discharged from the hospital in the autumn of 1952. Fumiko came to take him home. He went back to the house in Nagano. The garden was there, as she had said, overgrown but recognizable. The stone path, the old plum tree. He walked through it on his first morning back, slowly, the way you walk through a place you have been carrying in your memory for so long that the real version feels both exactly right and slightly foreign, like hearing a word spoken aloud that you have only ever read. He never flew again. Not because he was prohibited. Not because the doctors recommended against it. He simply stopped. The people who knew him, Fumiko, the handful of friends who had survived the war and maintained contact, did not ask him why directly. They understood, or thought they did. Pierce, who exchanged letters with Yamamoto for years afterward, and received occasional fragments of news about Keiji through this channel, had his own understanding. The cockpit had been the last place where Keiji knew who he was, and he had finally, on a coral airstrip in March 1952, found out who he was outside it. Not a pilot, not a soldier, not the man who held, just a man. Standing in a garden in Nagano, with a plum tree and a stone path, and a sister who had waited, and a morning that had nothing in it to report. He had been waiting for orders for 8 years. The last order he ever received, standing on the airstrip while the general spoke, had been the simplest one anyone had ever given him. You are relieved. And for the first time in a very long time, Keiji Nakamura did not know what to do next. And for the first time in a very long time, that was perfectly fine.